In the winter of 1692, in a small village called Salem, something evil awakened. Not the devil they feared, but something far more terrifying. The darkness within human hearts themselves, the capacity for cruelty that lies dormant in every community, waiting for the right spark to ignite it into an inferno of accusations, betrayals, and death. Picture this: a frozen Massachusetts morning, where Puritan families lived under the watchful eyes of God and their neighbors. A place where one whisper could destroy a life, where fear ruled every waking moment, where the line between righteousness and madness had become so blurred that nobody could tell the difference anymore. And that confusion would soon cost innocent people everything they had, including their lives. But this isn't just another ghost story you tell around a campfire. This is about real people who died screaming their innocence to an unforgiving sky. Real families torn apart by suspicion and greed. A community that devoured itself from the inside out. Neighbor turning against neighbor until the streets ran red with the blood of the innocent. This is the Salem Witch Trials, and it's a story that will chill you to your very core. It started with two little girls, as so many horrors do. Betty Perez, age 9, and her cousin Abigail Williams, 11 years old. In January of 1692, they began having fits, violent convulsions that no doctor could explain. They screamed as if possessed by demons. They threw things across the room with inhuman strength. They contorted their young bodies in ways that seemed impossible, their spines arching backwards, their limbs twisting at unnatural angles. The village doctor, William Griggs, examined them thoroughly and came to a chilling conclusion. He told their parents what they already feared in their hearts: the evil hand is upon them. With those 6 words, he opened the gates of hell. Now, these weren't just any girls. Betty was the daughter of Reverend Samuel Parris, the village minister. And in Puritan Salem, the minister's household was supposed to be beyond reproach, a beacon of godliness in a dark world. But something dark had entered that holy home, and the adults demanded answers. Who had bewitched these innocent children? Who had signed their name in the devil's book? Under relentless pressure, under threats and manipulation, the girls finally gave them what they wanted: 3 names. 3 women who couldn't defend themselves. 3 scapegoats to bear the weight of an entire community's fear and paranoia. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar who wandered the streets muttering to herself, her mind broken by poverty and loss. Sarah Osborne, a bedridden elderly woman who hadn't attended church in over a year because her body was failing her. And Tituba, Reverend Parris's slave from Barbados, a woman whose dark skin and foreign ways already made her suspect in the eyes of these pale Puritans. You see the pattern here, don't you? The vulnerable, the outcasts, the ones who couldn't fight back. On February 29, 1692, these 3 women were arrested and thrown into prison. The jail was a nightmare of cold stone and darkness, where prisoners were chained to walls and left to rot in their own filth. And with their imprisonment, hell's gates swung wide open, and something ancient and evil walked freely through the streets of Salem, wearing the mask of justice and speaking in the language of God. Sarah Good denied everything, as any innocent person would. She cursed her accusers from her jail cell, which only convinced them more of her guilt, because in their twisted logic, an innocent woman would beg for mercy, not demand justice. Sarah Osborne protested her innocence until her dying breath, which came in that very prison, in the cold and the dark, without trial, without dignity, without anyone to hold her hand as she slipped away from this cruel world. But Tituba, she was smarter than her accusers realized. She told them exactly what they wanted to hear, spinning tales that would save her life while condemning dozens of others. She confessed to meeting the devil, described him as a tall man from Boston, dressed in black. She spoke of a book bound in human skin, of signatures written in blood that glowed in the darkness. She told them there were other witches in Salem, many witches, hidden among them like wolves in sheep's clothing. And with those words, with that confession, she saved her own skin while lighting a fire that would consume the entire village. Because now the hunt was truly on, and nobody was safe anymore. The hysteria spread like wildfire through dry timber, jumping from house to house, from family to family. More girls started having fits, as if the madness was contagious. Ann Putnam, Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, Elizabeth Hubbard, one by one they fell into convulsions and pointed their trembling fingers at their neighbors. And with each accusation, the profile of the accused changed in terrifying ways. It wasn't just the outcasts anymore, not just the poor and the different. Now it was church members, respected pillars of the community, prosperous farmers whose land others coveted, even a former minister who had dared to question the proceedings. The witch hunt was consuming everyone, respecting neither age nor station, nor years of faithful service to God and community. By May, Governor William Phipps had established a special court of oyer and terminer. That's old legal speak for hear and determine, fancy words for a kangaroo court that had already decided the verdict before hearing any evidence. Their job was supposedly to try the accused witches, to separate the guilty from the innocent. But here's the thing about these trials that will make your blood run cold. They were rigged from the very start, designed not to find truth, but to confirm what people already believe. The judges allowed something called spectral evidence to be admitted in court. Think about what that means for a moment. If an accuser said they saw your spirit, your invisible ghost, attacking them in their sleep, that was considered proof of witchcraft. You could be in your home, surrounded by witnesses who swore you never left. But if someone claimed your spectral form flew through their window and tormented them, you were guilty. There was no defense against such accusations, no way to prove you didn't do something invisible and impossible. The first to be tried was Bridget Bishop, a woman whose crimes were owning a tavern and wearing a red bodice, scandalous by Puritan standards. They said she looked at men with too much boldness, that she laughed too loudly, that she didn't know her place. On June 10th, 1692, she was found guilty by a jury of men who had already made up their minds. 8 days later, she was hanged from a tree on Gallows Hill, while a crowd of her former neighbors watched and cheered. One judge, Nathaniel Saltonstall, couldn't stomach what he was seeing. He resigned from the court in protest, the only one with the courage to walk away. His colleagues continued without him, their conviction unwavering, their righteousness absolute. They believed they were doing God's work, saving their community from Satan's influence, and that belief made them capable of unspeakable cruelty, without a shred of guilt or doubt. July 19th, 1692. A date that should live in infamy. 5 women were led to Gallows Hill in chains. Sarah Good, Rebecca Nurse, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. They proclaimed their innocence until the very end, their voices growing hoarse from screaming the truth that nobody wanted to hear. Rebecca Nurse was 71 years old, a respected church member, beloved by her community for decades of kindness and charity. But the jury found her guilty anyway, and even when they had second thoughts, even when they tried to reconsider their verdict, the judges pushed them back toward condemnation. As Sarah Good stood on the gallows with the noose around her neck, Reverend Nicholas Noyes had the audacity to urge her one last time to confess her sins. Her response has echoed through history. "You are a liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." Those were the last words she spoke before they pulled the lever and left her swinging in the summer breeze, her body jerking and twitching as life left it slowly, agonizingly. August 19th brought another execution day, another parade of innocence to the gallows. This time it was John Proctor, a farmer who had dared to speak out against the madness of the trials. George Burroughs, a former minister whose only crime was being different, being educated, being unafraid. John Willard, who had refused to arrest any more accused witches because his conscience wouldn't allow it. Martha Carrier, George Jacobs Sr., all of them marched to their deaths while the crowd hurled insults and rotten vegetables at them. George Burroughs did something remarkable on the scaffold that day. He recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, word for word, without a single mistake. This was supposedly something witches couldn't do. Their tongues would twist on the holy words. The crowd grew restless, doubt creeping into their bloodthirsty certainty. But Cotton Mather, the famous minister and intellectual, rode his horse right up to the gallows and shouted that the devil could quote scripture too, that Satan was the great deceiver. And just like that, the doubt vanished and Burroughs died choking on the rope. September 22nd brought the final executions, the last act of this bloody play. 8 more souls sent to their deaths in a single day. Among them was Martha Corey, whose husband Giles had been pressed to death just 3 days earlier, in perhaps the most horrific execution of all. They wanted Giles to enter a plea, to say either guilty or not guilty, because if he was convicted, the law allowed them to seize his property and leave his family destitute. So Giles refused to speak, knowing his silence was the only way to protect his children's inheritance. So they laid that 80-year-old man on the ground and placed a wooden board across his chest. Then they began piling heavy stones on top, one by one, crushing him slowly, trying to force words from his lips. For 2 days, they tortured him like this. His ribs cracked. His lungs struggled for air. Blood ran from his mouth. Each time they asked for his plea, he only said 2 words: more weight. Even as his body was being crushed, he died defiant, unbroken, saving his family's future with his final labored breaths. But something was changing in Salem. A shift in the wind that would finally end this nightmare. The accusations had gone too far, had reached too high. When the afflicted girls accused Lady Phipps, the governor's own wife, of witchcraft, suddenly the people in power started paying attention in a different way. Suddenly, the rules needed to change. Suddenly, maybe spectral evidence wasn't so reliable after all. Isn't it interesting how justice only matters when it threatens the powerful? Influential ministers who had remained silent began speaking out, finding their courage now that the witch hunt had turned its hungry eyes toward Boston's elite. Increase Mather, one of the most respected theologians in Massachusetts, wrote a treatise arguing, It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned. Revolutionary words in a time of madness. The tide of public opinion was finally turning, but 20 people were already dead, crushed under the weight of paranoia and fear. In October 1692, Governor Phipps prohibited further arrests for witchcraft. He dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer, admitting what should have been obvious from the start, that the trials were a travesty of justice. By May of the following year, he pardoned all remaining accused witches and released them from their dungeons. The nightmare was over, at least officially. But you can't pardon the dead, can't give them back the lives that were stolen from them. The final toll was staggering in its cruelty. 19 people hanged on Gallows Hill, their bodies left to swing as warnings. One man, Giles Corey, pressed to death under heavy stones. At least 5 more died in prison from the cold, disease, and mistreatment, including Sarah Osborne and an infant born to Sarah Good behind bars, a baby who never had a chance at life. 25 souls lost to madness and fear, and countless others whose lives were destroyed, even though they survived. In the years that followed, many of the accusers recanted their testimony, though their apologies rang hollow in the ears of the dead. And Putnam, Jr., one of the primary accusers whose testimony had condemned so many, publicly apologized in 1706. She claimed she had been deluded by Satan into making false accusations, shifting the blame even in her confession. But we have to ask ourselves, was she really deluded? Or was she a young girl who enjoyed the power and attention that came from pointing her finger? Some of the judges expressed regret, though again, too late for those they'd sentenced to death. Samuel Sewall stood before his congregation in 1697 and publicly accepted blame and shame for his role in the trials, asking God and his community for forgiveness. At least he had the courage to admit his sins. But others, like William Stoughton, the Chief Justice, never admitted wrongdoing, never showed remorse. He went to his grave believing he had done the right thing, that the witches were real and deserved their fate. The Massachusetts colonial government eventually declared the trials unlawful and the convictions null and void. They granted financial compensation to the families of victims, blood money that could never wash away the stain of what had happened. But no amount of money could bring back the dead, could heal the shattered trust between neighbors, could erase the trauma that would haunt Salem for generations. The scars ran too deep, the wounds too fresh, even decades later. So what really happened in Salem? That's the question historians still debate today. Were the girls lying from the start, making it all up for attention? Were they genuinely experiencing some kind of illness that was misinterpreted as possession? Modern theories suggest everything from ergot poisoning in the rye grain supply, which can cause hallucinations and seizures, to mass hysteria, a psychological phenomenon where symptoms spread through a community like a contagion. From childhood trauma and abuse to deliberate, calculated fraud designed to settle old scores and seize property. Some historians point to deeper social and economic tensions that had been brewing for years. Salem Village and Salem Town were in constant conflict, farming families versus merchant families, old money versus new. Many of the accusers were from farming families struggling financially, while many of the accused were connected to the more prosperous merchant class or owned land that others coveted. Was this really about witchcraft, Or was it about greed dressed up in religious righteousness? About jealousy wearing the mask of God's justice? Others see it as a cautionary tale about the dangers that lurk in every society. The dangers of religious extremism taken to its logical conclusion. Power. Authority unchecked by reason or mercy. Justice corrupted by fear and prejudice. What happens when we let terror override reason? When we value conformity over truth? When we punish difference instead of celebrating it? The Salem Witch Trials show us how quickly civilization can crumble when we forget that we're all human, all capable of evil, all in need of grace. The Salem Witch Trials lasted less than a year, just 10 months from first accusation to final pardon. But their shadow stretches across centuries, touching us even now. They remind us how quickly civilization can crumble when fear takes hold. How easily good people can be swept up in evil when they believe they're doing the right thing. How fear can make monsters of us all, transforming neighbors into executioners, friends into accusers, a community into a killing machine that feeds on its own members. Today, if you visit Salem, Massachusetts, you'll find a memorial to the victims. 20 simple stone benches, each one engraved with a name and the date of execution. Some bear the final words spoken before death. I'm innocent. God knows I am innocent. I am no witch. 20 benches for 20 complex lives, cut short by accusations built on nothing but air and fear. Visitors leave flowers and notes, apologies that come 3 centuries too late, but matter nonetheless. We like to think we've evolved since then, that such hysteria couldn't happen in our modern enlightened age. But look around at our world today and ask yourself if that's really true. The targets have changed. The methods are different, but the pattern remains disturbingly familiar. Find the different. Fear the other. Demonize what we don't understand. Destroy those who threaten the status quo. From McCarthyism to modern social media witch hunts, we keep repeating the same mistakes, just with different names and different excuses. The real terror of Salem wasn't supernatural, wasn't about ghosts or demons or dark magic. It was human. It was neighbors betraying neighbors for profit and power. Children lying about adults because they enjoyed the attention. You just ignoring evidence because they'd already decided who was guilty. A community tearing itself apart from the inside out because fear had replaced reason, because hysteria had replaced justice, because in the end, the devil they feared wasn't real, but the evil they committed in his name certainly was. So remember their names, not as abstract historical figures, but as real people who suffered and died. Remember Rebecca Nurse, who forgave her accusers even as they led her to the gallows in chains. Remember Giles Corey, who endured 2 days of torture rather than give his persecutors the satisfaction of a plea. Remember Bridget Bishop, hanged for the crime of wearing red and speaking her mind. Remember John Proctor, killed for speaking truth to power when silence would have saved him. Remember all 25 of them, because forgetting the victims is how we allow history to repeat itself, over and over, in an endless cycle of fear and violence. The Salem Witch Trials taught us that evil doesn't always announce itself with horns and a pitchfork and a forked tail. Sometimes it wears the face of righteousness and speaks in the language of justice. Sometimes it comes dressed as God's work, wrapped in prayers and scripture. Sometimes it hides behind the words for your own good, or for the safety of the community, or to protect our children. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying truth of all. The lesson that should keep us awake at night and vigilant during the day. The devil they feared in 1692 wasn't hiding in the shadows of the forest or lurking in the dark corners of their barns. He was standing right there in the courtroom, wearing a judge's robe and pounding a gavel. He was in the pews on Sunday, singing hymns with blood on his hands. He was in the hearts of every person who chose fear over compassion, who chose conformity over truth, who chose to believe comfortable lies over uncomfortable reality. That's where the real evil lives, and it's still there today, waiting for the right conditions to emerge again. This was the story of the Salem Witch Trials, one of the darkest chapters in American history. Not a supernatural horror story, but something far more frightening because it actually happened. A reminder that the monsters we should fear most are the ones we create ourselves, the ones we become when we let fear rule our hearts and minds. The accused are long dead. Their accusers are long dead. But the lessons remain alive, urgent, demanding that we pay attention. Because if we don't learn from Salem, if we don't remember what happened when fear replaced reason, then we're condemned to repeat it. And next time, it might be your name they call, your life they take, your family they destroy. Remember, Salem. Remember the cost of fear. And never, ever forget that evil flourishes not in darkness, but in the bright light of day, when good people choose to look away.